referred to here as unilateral coercive measures is that they seek the product of total destruction that comes from war, all in order to prevent actual war, allegedly. The underlying purpose and original design of sanctions or other unilateral coercive measures dating back to antiquity has always been to inflict hunger, pestilence, and suffering on civilian populations. In the late 19th century and the early 20th century, economic weapons were the ultimate weapons. Up until World War II, hundreds of thousands of deaths by economic isolation were the chief man-made cause of civilian death in conflict. United States President Woodrow Wilson said that economic weapons like sanctions are infinitely more terrible instrument of war than war itself. Wilson's comments drew on the horrors of the Persian famine in 1917 to 1919, which claimed 2 million lives through military occupation and economic blockade. And as famine emerged during World War II, this reinforced the belief that the threat of isolation from the world was in fact so great that no nation would dare break international protocols for fear of inflicting pestilence on its own population. This is to say that before the atomic bomb, economic weapons were the most feared deterrent to conflict. Now, throughout the 20th century, ham-fisted sanctions, better described as blockades, have been routinely applied to promote regime changes. Cuba has faced and continues to face relentless unilateral coercive measures that are meant to create isolation, stagnation, and deprivation, even by specifically targeting food and medicine. Many nations banned trade with Iraq in the 1990s, causing a grinding breakdown of sanitation and health services in that country. A country that was very dependent on imports that saw its economy shrink by 2/3. And as a result, sanitation, health, and education infrastructure nearly collapsed. Now, with such lessons in mind, the 21st century has witnessed a rapid increase in the use of unilateral coercive measures, sometimes referred to as smart or strategic sanctions. Now, this method targets individuals within a government or assets a person in a targeted government may possess abroad. And unlike the first wave of seeking destruction or the second wave of threatening total destruction, this third wave of UCMs, the threat is of isolation from global markets. But the hope, instead of causing pestilence, is just to cause financial ruin for individuals. Now today, there are over 70,000 unique sanctioned persons and entities worldwide, a 370% increase since 2017. Over 16,500 are aimed directly at the Russian Federation in response to the war in Ukraine. I suggest this Council that the purpose of even the allegedly smartest sanctions continue to inflict unnecessary and often unintended harm against civilians. Food security is both the victim and the bellwether for understanding how economic weapons harm the innocent and vulnerable communities in both targeted and in non-targeted nations. While sanctions may appear smarter, more targeted, or even softer, they continue to hold to their original purpose, which is to harm civilian populations. Pursuing peaceful global protocols through unilateral coercive measures is tantamount to a glassblower reaching for a sledgehammer to craft his work. They just don't work. As smart as sanctions are supposed to be, there will always be unintended consequences and, as a result, humanitarian harm. As I see it, these consequences occur in three ways. First, as has been mentioned, overcompliance by the private sector. It leads to a noticeable deprivation of imports as companies withdraw entirely from areas targeted by UCMs. The United States and the EU sanctions against Russia did not block food or fertilizer outright for export, but they did disrupt the movement of those goods globally and at a significant cost. And since Russia controls a third of the world's phosphate fertilizers and companies struggled to export after being cut off from global financial networks, and shipping insurers also avoided Russian assets, fertilizer prices jumped by 50% since the beginning of the war. Farmers in the global south paid that price. And likewise, Russia's blockade of Ukrainian grain exports pushed the United Nations Food Price Index to an all-time high in March of 2022. As a result, 8.2% of the global population, that's some 673 million people, experienced hunger in 2024. My second point is that humanitarian harm shows up directly on people's dinner plates. Broadly speaking, UCMs make hunger worse. Even targeted sanctions against government officials and the affluent will quickly trickle down to the broader population. It involves higher prices for food and fuel, broken trade links, and job losses. Heavily sanctioned nations like Venezuela, Iran, Syria, and Sudan all face limited food and fertilizer imports and often empty shelves as a result of it. Now, I've conducted much research on this, and my assistants and I have shown that UCMs cause an immediate decline in imported proteins. Targeted countries scramble to find local alternatives, which increases vulnerability in what food is available, how is it consumed, and the labor required to obtain it. Women often dedicate more hours to acquiring food through local networks, and a lack of fertilizer and climate shocks further destabilize production. The third point I would like to quickly make is that targeted nations often rely on so-called pressure valves of acquiring foreign resources outside of central banking systems. Recently, targeted nations have turned to gold and cryptocurrency for that, but those items do not have the same mechanism as central banking platforms do to help respond to shocks or crises that happen internally. So in closing, let me just say that issuing nations often fail to understand this, that humanitarian harm may not be the intention of a sanction, but it is always the consequence. I urge a simple realization that, simply put, UCMs are the wrong tool for behavior change writ large. Muchísimas gracias.